So this video is the first of a two-part series on conducting a data analysis. In the first video, what we're going to see is an example of developing a plan for the data analysis. And we do this plan so that we are thinking through the steps before we go ahead and dive into the analysis. The plan also documents our steps so that we can reproduce this later on, or somebody else may reproduce our results as well by following the same procedure that we put together. So the purpose of the analysis is that we can respond confidently to the research questions. We can use our data and apply statistical methods to have a confidence response to our research questions that will help us guide us towards a solution to our research problem. So in this statistical analysis, we're going to use Excel to apply the chi-squared statistical measure to our ordinal data. And this is where we're going to be comparing the results of students, of our online students responding to survey questions, to those of our on-campus students responding to Likert-style survey questions. And we will use the results of this chi-squared to evaluate our null hypothesis. So before we begin our analysis, we really need to go back to the project description so that we understand what we're trying to accomplish. So going back to the research problem, we defined the research problem as that we wanted to improve student success in our online courses, but we're not sure the most effective way to do this. So then the purpose of this study is to evaluate student survey data so that we can determine the unique attributes of online learning and contrast this to our on-campus or main campus students. So then we came up with three research questions. First of all, what are the strengths of teaching online? What are the weaknesses of teaching online? And then, are online students less satisfied than on-campus students? So in order to answer, we can answer those three research questions as a way to identify the solution to our problem. So that's just to set our baseline of what we're going to do in our analysis. We're going to focus on these research questions so that we can go ahead and find a solution. Next, we're going to move to our assessment tab so that we can look back at what we did for our assessment. So during the assessment, we noticed that there's quite a few survey questions that were only used for a very short period of time. So we're going to consider those out of scope. We want to look at the survey questions, these 16 survey questions that were used for a majority of the surveys. And so what I did is I highlighted the ones that we're going to exclude from our scope in gray, and so that only the questions that are left in white here are going to be included in our survey, in our analysis of the survey questions. So that helps us define the survey questions that we're going to look at. And then what we're going to do is we're going to compare the student responses for our online students to these 16 questions to the student responses from our main campus students for these 16 questions to see if there is a difference, and if that difference is statistically significant. And that will help us understand what the differences are between our online students and their response to these survey questions compared to our main campus students. All right, now that we have defined the scope of our analysis, the next step is to plan out our analysis of what we're going to do to measure this. So I go to my Notes tab, and I'm going to scroll down to the data analysis procedure. So here's the procedure that I put together to define what I'm going to do for this analysis. First, I'm going to go ahead and state the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. Then what I'm going to do is I know that I'm going to need a subset of the data because we're going to be excluding so many questions. So what I did is I copied the data tab to create a new tab called Dataset. And that's going to be the set of data that's going to be a subset of the original data that I'm using for this analysis. So I knew that through that assessment, I found that the survey questions that are within the scope, those 16 questions we're going to look at, they were not used until the fall of 2014. So what I did is I sorted the data set, that subset of data, by term name, and then removed all rows that were associated with surveys that were prior to fall of 2014. All right, next what I did is I saw that we have 36,209 records remaining. And what I did then is I removed all survey questions that were outside of the scope, so that were associated with those questions that were highlighted in gray on my assessment tab, or the questions that were not part of the 16 questions that I'm going to include in my evaluation. So then what I did is, after I removed those, I looked at question 209, which asked about for the number of hours rather than the Likert type of survey question. And so that is also going to be considered outside the scope of the survey. So after removing that question, I'm left with 36,203 records. So now I've got my subset of data that I want to work with. And since I'm going to be comparing Likert responses, and Likert responses are really categorical responses and not numerical. So I'm going to be using a chi-squared test to measure the differences between the online students and the main campus students. So I'm setting up my analysis to do a chi-squared test for each of the 16 questions, where I compare the online student response to that question to the main campus student response to that question. What I did is, when I was working on this, I found that Excel, when you run the chi-squared function in Excel, it only returns the probability, which it's useful, but for this case, I wanted to see the actual results so that I can provide more transparency in my analysis. So rather than just simply using the chi-squared function, I created my own summary tables. So I ended up creating 32 summary tables to evaluate the 16 questions, and took the manual approach for doing this. So then, while I was executing that, I also found the 95% confidence interval that needs to, the result that would allow us to reach the 95% confidence interval, and I reported that. And then once I've calculated my results, I reported each of the results at that 95% confidence level, but I also wanted to provide additional insight. So then what I did is I compared the percent of online student responses for each of the survey questions, and compared those to the percent of main campus students' response for that same question, so that I can see if there's a difference between how online versus on-campus students responded to each of the questions. And I also compared the means for the online students versus the main campus students. And then once I was done with those three forms of analysis, I reported the results. I summarized the results through a series of observational statements to demonstrate and to communicate what I've observed from this analysis. So this is the procedure that I used for the data analysis on my survey data.